Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to the Energy Transition Dialogues feature hydrogen interview. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Robert Aguilera, Senior Research Fellow at Curtin University in Perth at the Oil and Gas Innovation Centre. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Happy to be with you.
Great to have you. Well, as we do on this feature interview series, we like to sort of delve into our guest speakers' opinions on where the hydrogen story is at, what challenges still face the industry, both producers and consumers of that future fuel, if you like. I mean, it's been around for ages, but we're talking about now green hydrogen and developing blue further, and what obstacles remain to be tackled, and how good a job governments and the private sector are doing about that. So thanks again for joining us. Let me start, Dr. Aguilera. I know you're based in Australia, and I have a nice chart here, which I believe I got off one of your recent presentations, which is showing that Australia holds 23% of today's hydrogen projects worldwide. Ahead of that is us here in the Middle East with 34%. So give us a view from Australia first of where this industry, this new, relatively new sector is in terms of where it's going as we move forward.
Well, here in Australia, despite being so reliant on fossil fuels, after the pandemic, that pressure to accelerate the energy transition has really intensified. And that's part of the reason why hydrogen has gotten so much attention. Now, Australia has strong renewable energy potential, particularly for solar, like the Middle East does, but also for wind. So we have a national hydrogen strategy here. And given that renewable potential, the green hydrogen, water-derived hydrogen, is very much the focus of that strategy. At the same time, Australia's a massive natural gas producer and exporter. Depending how you count, might be the #1 LNG exporter in the world. So there may also be potential for the gas-derived so-called blue hydrogen as well. And for the rest of this decade then, Australia looks to be one of the big producers and exporters around the world. And as you said, they will be competing with other exporters like the Middle East for some of the same customers in Europe. But the main target in this part of the world will be the Asia Pacific, Australia's usual trade partners, consisting of South Korea, China, and particularly Japan.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about those export markets. I was going to get onto that a bit later, but you've segued into that nicely for us. And we can talk about Australia and the Middle East, but those regions that you expect will be exporters of hydrogen or hydrogen products, whether in liquid form or other. And let's talk about the demand for hydrogen in the export market. Europe is obviously one of those centers as well. You mentioned Asia, but how would you qualify Europe and Asia as two receptive customers in the next 10-year period for both Australia and the Middle East?
Yeah, well, if you look at it from the point of view of energy demand growth, as we know, Asia will be responsible for virtually all of the world's future energy demand growth. The opportunity in Europe has more to do with altering their energy mix, so reducing the reliance on fossil fuels, in particular natural gas, and increasing hydrogen. So that's the focus for the next decade. And those are the two regions that will be the big importers, and pretty much every other region of the world, not just Middle East and Australia, but also North America. They will all be competing in these regions, importing regions. And I'd say Middle East, North America probably have an advantage when it comes to the European market, whereas Australia, because of its geographical location and existing relationships in Asia, will have an advantage when it comes to that market.
Okay, and what about domestic consumption in Australia in terms of sectoral off-takers where you can, obviously supply your own industries with what it needs, with a cleaner fuel. Obviously, Australia is still also a big producer of coal, exporter of coal, and perhaps still using some as well. But domestic versus exports for Australia in particular, where does that stand, do you think?
Interestingly, if you were to look at the hydrogen strategy of Australia and also the strategies of the individual states within the country, the emphasis tends to be on exports of hydrogen. The same is true for the gas industry of Australia. Much of it is contracted for export to Asia, and it becomes something of a sensitive topic. There's a gas crisis right now in the eastern states of Australia. It turns out that despite being very well endowed with gas, there isn't enough right now to satisfy domestic requirements and meet export obligations. So already in the hydrogen industry, there's similar talk about whether there should be, for example, a hydrogen reservation policy where a certain percentage of the production is reserved for domestic usage. Now, that being said, I mean, the opportunities for hydrogen domestically, I'd say are rather limited to particular applications. One of those will be heavy duty long haul transportation, and the other one will be around hydrogen hubs. So trying to move the consumption to the points of production, making use of large facilities and gaining from those economies of scale to make it economically attractive. The reason for this is that we have a very large country here that's difficult to connect. It's surrounded by coastal cities and requires huge investments in infrastructure to try to get these places connected in terms of energy and other goods and services.
Yeah, I mean, let's talk about infrastructure then, because that is one big part of, the argument, how does the world scale up hydrogen use? Obviously, infrastructure is a big part of that. The technology, you could argue, is there. It's the infrastructure, it's the transport, storage, story. So even whether you look at Australia as a country on its own in terms of connectivity within that, or infrastructure across regions, are we seeing enough investment or even interest in that part of the equation for hydrogen? Are we focusing too much on the technology and CCS and etc., and not enough on the storage aspect?
Scale, that's one of the issues. If you were to look at the supply side of the equation, like any product, once produced, the hydrogen has to be packaged, transported, dispensed, and stored throughout the supply chain. So it's a massive undertaking. The problem is that a precondition for investment has to do with producers having that confidence that there will be security of demand for their product. And that's the issue right now. If you talk to some of the companies around here investing in hydrogen, they're moving forward with it. They're under intense pressure to reduce emissions, improve their environmental performance, especially, of course, the energy companies. And so they're investing in clean technologies like CCS, but also hydrogen, yet they are doing so without the assurance of having security of demand. They're scared that they'll develop this product and then it will not be consumed. For that reason, governments are speaking at a high level, making agreements. They're not, set in stone. Rather, they're just the intention to develop these kind of long-term agreements. Some important consumers like Japan are investing in the producer country, Australia, in the hydrogen industry. So the intention is there. Probably a precondition for success will be something like what we see in the LNG industry in this part of the world. Given the geography, the long distances, and the need for complex shipping over the sea, it will probably require a similar market structure where there are these long-term agreements and the price is set based on these bilateral negotiations between buyer and seller.
Okay, that's interesting. And let's talk a bit about LNG. I mean, as you said, Australia is a main producer and exporter of that. You know, what transferable sort of infrastructure, you know, or skill sets do you think, you said you can base it on the energy model in terms of pricing, possibly in contracts, but what about physical infrastructure, you know, skill sets, know-how? Is there any link there that we can make use of?
Yeah, so even though the focus in these high-level strategy documents of the government is on the green hydrogen, some of the investment taking place and the plans, especially by the oil and gas companies, are blue hydrogen. The first obvious link is for them to use their product, natural gas, to make the hydrogen. There's also some synergies around storage and delivery technologies. That includes, to some extent, LNG. When they have experience in that industry, some of that could be transferable to a hydrogen export industry, even though the ships themselves would be different, hydrogen requiring cryogenics technology, but still they would be able to utilize previous research and designs for LNG shipping. So often in my presentations around here, I do emphasize the link between natural gas and LNG and hydrogen. And in the past in this country, for example, the former chief scientist was pushing any type of hydrogen as long as it is a low emission or zero emission resource. And that would include, for example, the brown hydrogen, which is coal derived. In fact, the first shipment of liquefied hydrogen out of Australia happened earlier this year. And that was coal derived with the CO2 captured and stored underground. And that was shipped off to Japan.
Yeah, a lot of advocates of the industry would say that let's not focus too much on color. Let's just get more hydrogen, cleaner fuel sort of out there in the space. But what about that sort of, if you like, obviously we have a combination right now. Green is at the newest part of the spectrum, and on a cost basis, it's not yet competitive. How much acceptance do you think there is amongst the stakeholders, investors, etc., in this industry, that we should continue with this combination of green and blue at the same time, moving on different tracks with brown, with pink, you name it, and how much opposition is there to that? You think, you know, should we be focusing much more on green, and resources going towards bringing those costs down faster?
And there's also a lot of excitement around the white or gold pure hydrogen underground. It's being mapped in Australia currently. And my view is that all of the colors should be considered depending on the strengths and weaknesses of a particular region, even within a country. If you were to look somewhere else, like in Canada, hydroelectricity may be used for hydrogen. Countries that are strong in nuclear energy may consider that for their hydrogen. In Australia, this large coal industry, if it can be combined effectively with CCS, could also be a consideration. But I do believe that gas is the big one that realistically has the greatest chances for an intermediary period over the coming decades that can help scale up the industry, create demand for hydrogen until the green variety is then ready to come in. Because as you mentioned, the green hydrogen is still high cost. And in the end, economics play a major role in determining the winner. Of course, there is impressive cost reducing progress in hydrogen technology, as well as the input renewable electricity continues to come down, the costs do. So it may be competitive with blue hydrogen further into the future, especially if it receives policy support. But until then, I believe it would be important to develop the blue hydrogen as well, if it is indeed expected to somehow be a contributor to satisfying future energy requirements.
And I mean, let's talk a bit about the green side of that a little bit. One technology that many advocates in the industry do agree needs faster, quicker, as much as possible development is, upscaling the electrolyzer capacities. That is a challenge. That is something that's obviously improving. Certain regions are doing better than others in terms of adding to that capacity. The Middle East is Saudi Arabia is doing, making a lot of effort. How much of a challenge is that? I mean, is that going to be holding green back a lot, or do you expect to see progress on that front? Do we need more private sector funds going into that?
Well, if you review available information, in general, I'd say that in the total cost of green hydrogen production, the renewable electricity input represents some 2/3 of the total cost, and the remaining third is accounted for by the electrolyzer. So there would be opportunity for improvements in electrolysis to help to reduce costs, and that will come with continued development of electrolyzers. As the manufacturing steps up, then that industry can benefit from economies of scale, improved efficiency, and better technology. So that will be an important determinant of overall cost for sure.
Okay, and you mentioned government and the government's role in terms of intergovernmental meetings happening to try and get on the same page of where we're going with this. In this part of the world, in the Middle East, where I am, there's still a lot of, as much as we're seeing a lot of billions of dollars going into hydrogen projects, a lot of industry stakeholders would say there's still a lack of clarity from policy makers on exactly what's what. There's the off-taker argument and security that you mentioned. But let's look at it from a global point of view, whether in Europe or Australia or Middle East, from the taxonomy definition side of things, in terms of, if people are going to invest, they want to know, or if they're going to use hydrogen, they're going to want to know, what credit do I get for using green or blue or gray? And that apparently is not well set yet. Where would you say, how important is that part of the equation?
Extremely. Apart from the technology and the costs, the continuity of policy support would be very necessary to develop hydrogen industry. And well, the point of hydrogen is to reduce emissions, and this is where climate policy comes in. And the basics of that policy are the same everywhere in the world, I would say, and it can be achieved either through enforced or forbidding regulation, or by introducing taxes on carbon, or by supporting through subsidies alternatives like hydrogen that emit less. So around the world, we'll likely see combinations of all of these policies that determine the winning fuels based on relative prices, where the policies either make the competing fuels, like the fossil fuels, more expensive, or they make the cleaner fuels more attractive by supporting them initially with grants and that type of government funding, and eventually subsidies, as they did with renewables like solar and wind. Importantly, however, of course, longer term, it is important for hydrogen to stand on its own. It has to be profitable if it's going to be a legitimate industry.
I mean, and given that, let's sort of circle back to where we are today. Clearly, the world and the consuming world is suffering today in terms of prices of energy, accessibility even of energy. You have the Russia war, Ukraine war, and Europe has just taken at least a step in banning some of those resources from coming to it. Clearly a very heightened state of stress in the energy sector, not the first time in history, and not the first time we've had oil above $100, gas prices arguably are facing even more of an uptick. But how much is the current crisis, energy security crisis, let's say, impacting, and is it impacting at all, the argument for continuing to invest in these newer solutions? Or are we taking a step back?
I mean, over the past decades, it's really been about many of the same energy topics like energy security or affordability or availability or environment, and they come in and out of focus depending on what's going on around the world. Earlier, I mentioned that post-pandemic, the energy transition received, I think, never before seen support. This year, with everything that's happening with Russia, Ukraine, energy security and affordability have come into focus. Consumers want their energy services to be available when needed, and they don't want to pay excessively high prices for them either. So the energy transition to some extent has slid off of the agenda, but that won't go away completely. Therefore, companies continue with their investment plans in hydrogen, whether it's the small ones or the large companies. But that being said, there's that word again, scale. I think it won't be necessary for hydrogen to be the sole energy provider long-term, just one in a group of sustainable resources.
Well, Dr. Roberto Aguilera, Senior Research Fellow at Curtin University in Perth, thank you very much for your time today, for joining us on the Hydrogen Interview. That's great to have your thoughts on that, and hope that you'll join us again on the program.
My pleasure, and thanks very much to you too.